The Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF, is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and a library for inclusive literature. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not be possible. Now, on to today's session. This session is Moving Beyond Fault Lines and Poisoned Wells. How can we heal India's social fabric? Panelists for this session are Aparna Vaidik, S. Irfan Habib, and Revati Lal. This session will be moderated by Arfa Khanum Sherwani. Arfa is a senior editor at The Wire and writes on politics and social justice. She has received a Red Ink Award, the Shatiya Saman Award from the Hindi Academy, and the Chameli Devi Jain Award for Outstanding Women Media Persons. Our interpreters for this session will be Preeti and Nitika from Access for All. That's all for me. Now over to you, Arfa. Arfa seems to have joined us.
Hi, Arfa.
Yeah, hi. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy and privileged to be here. And I think it's a very, very important topic, not just to understand history, but also the socio-political trends of our time. Today, for the next 1.5 hours, what we will try to discuss is moving beyond fault lines and poisoned wells. How can we heal India's social fabric? I mean, although it's a very, very difficult question, especially the second part of the discussion, how we can heal what has been wounded in the last several decades. So as we know, India is the largest democracy of the world and one of the most heterogeneous societies in the world. We are known for our diversity, but there are two major fault lines that India has. One is religion, another is caste, and mostly we've seen the divisive politics, the divisions, and even much of the violence that we've seen in the past and even now that we are living through, has also come through these cleavages, through these divisions, which was supposed to be our superpower as an diversity. But I think in the past, what we have tried to do is to look for similarities, commonalities, but the current day politics looks for the dissimilarities, the differences that shape our society in current day. So the major questions that we will be looking at in the next few minutes is that how might we understand episodes of divisive violence? We will try and go back into history and understand where exactly do we find the roots of the current day divisive politics and violence and divisions, and how has the violence been historically legitimized? Who benefits from these narratives of hate, and how might we reconstruct them in order to heal India's social? I would say the last question is the most difficult question, and that's also a futuristic question, as in how to go ahead. Can we actually do this, or we are beyond repair? Can we not go back to where we were, or maybe become better than we used to be? Because this is exactly not the kind of India that our forefathers and nation builders had imagined for ourselves. So another few questions that I would personally like to take is on the current socio-political trends. We will look at the politics in the last 6 years, and we will see the kind of religious and cultural nationalism that we have observed, whether this has added to the damage to our social fabric. Unity versus uniformity debate, whether uniformity is now the new unity, whether differences that we used to celebrate earlier, the diversity that we used to celebrate, now this is considered as a weakness, that everybody has to be in one color, one shape, one size. And also then another very important, we will try and dig deeper into the debate and we'll try to understand whether the divisions, the caste divisions within the Hindu society, not just the relations between Hindus and Muslims, Hindus and other religious communities, but the caste divisions within the Hindu society, whether the so-called Sanskritization or saffronization, or some people call it Hinduization of the middle caste and the lower caste, that has put a strain on Hindu-Muslim relationships. and also Hindu versus, say, Christian relationship for that matter. Then a very important thing, and we see this day in and day out, Twitter trends every third day, something on Mughal rule, something on Muslim rule. We will try to understand whether there is something really genuine to feel humiliated, to feel insulted for majority of the Hindu population of this country, because this is what our politics wants us today, to take kind of, to invoke it and in a way try to make India's Muslims answerable for what the Muslim rulers did few hundred years ago. So these are a lot of questions. I'm sure it's a very ambitious kind of a agenda as it is looking at the moment. I have a fantastic panel of guests with me at the moment. I have Professor Irfan Habib. He has worked in the area of history of science as well as political history. After teaching history for a few years, he joined the National Institute of Science, Technology and Development Studies in New Delhi. I have another guest with me, Aparna Vedic. She is Associate Professor of History of Ashoka University. She is at Ashoka University. She previously taught at Georgetown University, at the University of Delhi. Her creative nonfiction, My Son's Inheritance, A Secret History of Lynching and Blood Justice, was published this year only, 2020, and another book we are awaiting in 2021. And the third guest is Revati Lal, my former colleague at NDTV. She is an independent journalist, filmmaker, and the author of The Anatomy of Hate, published by Context, an imprint of Westland Books in December 2018. Welcome to all of you. Professor Irfan Habib Saab, I would like to begin this discussion with you. First of all, this very basic question I would want to ask you, that the social fabric that we keep talking about all the time, whether it ever actually existed, or this was just a common minimum program that we had found, the different communities in India, we had discovered for ourselves a formula that we could peacefully coexist. We may not have loved each other to the hilt, but do you think that coexistence and that social fabric, did it ever exist?
You see, by this question, you have to go back. I don't think you have to go back to medieval times or ancient times for that matter, because we live in a different world. For this, we need to go back only maybe 100 years, or maybe to the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, and see what sort of life we live, because that is the part of history which is close to us, close to our present, because you can't connect with medieval history the way it is being tried these days, and that question will come later on. So when you go to that part of history, you find that during the colonial period, when the struggle against the British was going on, and we saw a large number of instances of Hindu-Muslim cooperation and conflict simultaneously. What was this conflict and cooperation? A comfort level relationship. That was a relationship which was defined by most of our nationalist leaders, who tried to see India as inclusive India, as the nationalism itself was defined in very inclusive terms. So large number of people could live together, could work together, and the sort of hate towards each other which we see today was at least is not visible in this past 100 years. No, we don't see it. We see it briefly during the partition movement, at the time of partition, etc., or during the late 30s and mid 40s. From early 50s onwards, we come to a situation where there is an effort, a conscious effort to bring people together. And we lived in that world which we created, where we could respect each other, could, if not love, at least learn to live together, coexistence, as you said. So that sort of situation we could create for ourselves. Today, the difference is that the fault lines which we are talking about, those fault lines existed. It's not that they were not there. There were differences. There were problems at community level. There were issues which were divisive, which we tried to cover up and try to see that let us go beyond these divisions and find something which is common between us, something which we could share and take forward. Those efforts today, unfortunately, are not being made. So I'm saying fault lines did exist. Fault lines were not created in 6 years. Point is, there were people who could make attempts to go beyond fault lines, who could see them as fault lines or as something dangerous for the country, for the future of the country. So attempts were made to bring people together. So today, those efforts are actually missing, unfortunately, and that is our main problem. That we don't see these fault lines dangerous to our society. These fault lines are being used to take political interest forward, and we all know who is taking those interests forward and who is actually taking advantage of it, and that is a main issue. The electoral politics, unfortunately, now we talk about democracy. Democracy is fine, but the way democracy in countries like India is used for divisive purposes, on the basis of religion, on the basis of caste, on the basis of class, on the basis of gender. We use so many fault lines to actually divide people instead of bringing them together. The diversity, as you said, which was our main focus, main strength, has become actually our main weakness, because none of us want to, or people who are powerful today, who are running the country, they are not interested in celebrating their diversity. They want to exploit their diversity to take some sort of a majoritarian polarization forward. And that is the main crux of the problem. Unless that is resolved, unless everybody comes around to an idea that we have to live together the way we had been living all these years, and despite fault lines, we have to forget and ignore large number of things as we have been doing, and stop hating each other. And we hate each other for nothing. We don't even see each other's faces. Like on social media, we don't even know against whom you are speaking venom, but we do it all the time. So this sort of India we never lived before. This is, for me, new India, which is a dangerous India. And I hope we don't live in this India for very long. We get out of it as soon as possible.
I hope that too, but this looks like even all the more difficult. And I think this question that we've asked ourselves again and again in the last 6 years, we've asked this more than maybe the entire history of independent India. Aparna Vaidik, I would want to extend this question now, whether this whole idea of secularism, of social harmony, of this existent or non-existent social fabric that we keep talking about, Ganga, Jamni, Tehzeeb, tell me honestly whether it ever existed even, whether this was just a superficial idea that the ruling elite were trying to give it to people, but they were never ready to buy. If this is not the case, if this was already there, then how come only in the last 5-6 years, the whole legacy of 6 decades is being tried to wiped out?
Well, communal harmony is not an entirely construct. It did exist. Fault lines did exist. Now, the difference was how people negotiated in the past and how we are negotiating it today. Yeah, and an important variable, I think, today is technology. The way the news travels, the way we consume news, the way we consume ideas has changed. So the way we negotiate difference has changed. But, what I really would want to talk about is that there is a presumption that there's something was happening in 60 years and now something else is happening.
Yeah.
That there is some given heritage. And just a few things I want to just present for everyone's, just they can also reflect on it. Now, we feel that we were always tolerant, and somehow the tolerance is gone, and tolerance is something that needs to be recovered. But I would ask the question, why does the idea of tolerance fail to begin with? Why does it fail to serve our needs? And what is it about tolerance that refused to stick? If it was that great an idea, or if it was there, why is it refusing to stick? So the possible answers would be the state policies and this and that, the way state is mobilizing technology, the way it's mobilizing. But here, I give you one more idea. And that idea is for us to examine the shared ground between secular nationalism and Hindu nationalism. And I feel that they both share a ground. And I'll just walk you through that in the next 2 minutes. What is shared between Hindu nationalism and secular nationalism or secular idea of India is, we have the constitution, the flag, and the national anthem. Now, both sides invoke them in equal measure, and both sides see them as India's canon in equal measure. And taking this forward, if we were to see Savarkar's Hindutva ideology and Nehru's discovery of India as embodiments of ideas of Hindu nationalism and secular nationalism, respectively, then what is common between the two? It's not just the constitution, it's just not the flag and the national anthem. There is something else that is common there. And what is common is that both were written in jail, both talk about the nation space as home, both depict Hindus as the organic and the original inhabitants or claimants of India. Now, where they differ is how they see the Muslims. Now, for Savarkar, the Muslims are an enemy, a stranger, a foreigner, or a guest. Now, and the solution to the presence of Muslims in India is either you assimilate them or you evict them. Yeah, Kabristan, or you have the other option of assimilation. Now, on the other hand, in Nehru's vision, a Muslim is somebody who is backward, who is possessing communal consciousness, and a minor who needs to be protected. And this is the vision that is there in Discovery of India. वो पिछड़ा है, नाबालिग है, और अल्पसंख्यक है, नाबालिग है, पिछड़ा हुआ है. So उसके लिए क्या होना चाहिए? What should be there for somebody who is अल्पसंख्यक and who is minor, who is not just a minority but also a minor? What you have for that person is tolerance. You have sahanshilta, and you have protection, sanrakshan. Yeah, so he is the one who comes up with this idea of tolerance. Now, although they are differing on the way they think about Muslims, there is something common to them. And the common is that both of them are upper caste Hindus. Yeah, and Muslim in both the ideologies has a liminal space. It's a problem. The community is a problem that something needs to be done about it. And who will do something about it? The upper caste male. They will tell you that's the vision. So inherent in the idea of India is the idea of India, the very idea of India is an upper caste Hindu male idea. That's the problem. And now wo sar chad ke bol raha hai. Now it's acquired as big form. So this whole tolerance thing is, what is tolerance then? So if you were to ask the question, what is tolerance? So mainly tolerance is something granted by the people in power, who were conformed to the normative order. The sabal gives it to the ones who is the other. So there is no parasparik, there is no reciprocal in it, there is no apasdari in it. Tolerance is something that the Muslim receives or ought to receive from a Hindu. Yeah? So, and it is the hegemonic group that constructs the idea of the universal, that constructs the idea of secular. So who gets to be secular? Person like me. And who is the body that gets enacted on whom I enact my secularism? It's a Muslim. So, and then the Muslim becomes somebody who's saturated with religious and cultural identity that they can't do anything about, and I have to wean them away from it. Yeah, so वो धर्मलिप्त है, धर्मांध है, उनको तो नहीं पता, वो तो like that. So where does it leave the Muslims in India? Where it leaves them is that they have to bear the burden of Hindus' tolerance or the Hindus' practice of tolerance. So they are non-doers. They're not supposed to do anything. I'm going to solve it for them. Because I'm the Hindu, I've seen the vision, I know what to do about them, and I'm going to solve it for them. So, and the secular liberal inclusivity actually requires them to fit in on the terms of the hegemonic group. Yeah, so that is, I think, where the problem lies, that how are we understanding the problem? And then you have the Muslim, either, you have to fit in, or you do ritual performance of patriotism, take out the flag, pick up the constitution, sing the national anthem and all that. Or another option available to a Muslim is to become a Marxist. Yeah, so you disavow the religion and you fit into the sort of, So there are very few options available, because actually how they're being thought of are, they're not historical agents at all. So the problem of India is the gaze in which the country has been refracted, and the gaze is of an upper caste Muslim Hindu. So I'll start.
That's a very interesting insight into that. We keep comparing in India before 2014 and India after 2014, whether the roots of what we see today actually lies in pre-2014 India. Revati, I want to bring you into the debate at this moment. The idea of minority and majority At the time of India's partition, a lot of Muslims believed in India that was secular. They did not go to Pakistan, a country that was being formed and established in the name of their religion. They believed in a secular India, then Islamic Pakistan. All of these arguments I keep hearing from people, that is my older generation, that we chose Gandhi's India over Jinnah's Pakistan. But now when you go to social media, there is an entire generation of people, and trust me, these people are not BJP IT trolls alone. There may be, some of them may belong to them, but I'm saying there are very regular people, regular Hindus, who are nice Hindus, not necessarily that who actually believe in RSS ideology, or they are divisive in their day-to-day lives. They are nice people, like people of followers of any other religion. So I'm not saying people who are bigoted or hateful, but regular people, regular Hindus. They tell regular Muslims that India was divided in 1947. A whole country, a whole chunk of piece of land was given to you. Why you did not go there? So in place of let Muslim take pride in choosing India over Pakistan, they try and shame Muslims and say why you did not go, because this country and this land now belongs to us. Now tell me, is it just a media construct, you think, or is it deeper, much deeper into the society? How do you look at it?
Say that I agree with what all three of you have said, and I just want to add two things to this in answering my question. I have, as a journalist like you, looked at politics from below. So what has interested me also in the book that I took 13 years to write, called The Anatomy of Hate, is to look at what is it that has made this idea of violence and hate of Muslims by Hindus so attractive? Why is violence attractive? Because it is embodied in the person at the top, whether you look at Narendra Modi or the head of the RSS or the head of the VHP and their predecessors over time. But even if you look at, say, what the political alternative that we've thrown up as a body politic in recent times in the shape of, say, an Arvind Kejriwal is also the same right-wing Hindu persona. So why are we throwing up leaders like this? The question isn't about the leader. The leader is a mask of who we are as a majoritarian middle class. And that goes much deeper than just how the media describes it. The media is describing it because the media is also right-wing Hindu middle class upper caste, largely. You being an exception. I'm saying, by and large, so what we need to actually ask ourselves is, why do we find this idea of India more attractive than the Nehruvian idea, which itself had problems? I think the answer partly goes back to the creation of India in 1947 as two dichotomous ideas of India, but it also goes back to our post-liberalization politics. And it's not a coincidence that we became a market economy in 1991 and the Babri Masjid was brought down exactly 1 year later in 1992. It didn't take more than a year for the middle class to say, hey, we have been trying to upchuck the elite politics that has forced us to believe in Nehruvian idea all this while. And now we're saying we don't want it anymore. Off with their heads. We're replacing it with a Hindu majoritarian idea of India that we've always believed, but the elite has not allowed us to voice. When you look at it from the ground, from today's point of view of the middle class Hindu, I would say that the mistake that we in the media often make is to look at it as one thing. But actually in India, the most perplexing thing is that everything and its opposite is also always true at the same time. So the same right wing that shouts from the rooftops and trolls people like you on Facebook and Twitter and says all kinds of abominable things in person and online is also not certain of itself. It's doing this because it is displaying its utmost uncertainty of itself at a time when it is absolutely sure of its power. It is still emotionally an adolescent. And as any adolescent, they shout louder than everyone else and tells everybody else to shut up in order to be. This adolescent majoritarian Hindu middle class person is also displaying their uncertainty and their discomfiture with their own idea of themselves. And when you look at the rank and file, the mistake we make is that we always look at ideas as what Nehru thought, what Jinnah thought, what Patel thought, what Modi thinks. Actually, when you look at it from the bottom up, you get not a completely, but a very different picture. You get the picture of people who really don't have one position on things. They'll go with whichever the way the wind is blowing, and the wind is not necessarily steered only from the top in one direction. They will upchuck the BJP when they need to. They will go along with it when they need to. And that also, when we describe this as a mobile space, as a space where there are shifting loyalties, as a place which is not as hard-boiled and stuck in time as we imagine it to be, it also allows us to see a lot of rebellion and dissent within the rank and file of the Sangh. And that is our window of opportunity to explore, to understand what we can do with it. If we give that a voice, then we are giving it a being, we're giving it an entity, we are allowing it to exist. So far, we don't give that kind of dissonance a voice. I saw a lot of it as I traveled from Northeast India to Central India to Southern India during the elections, from Tripura and Assam to Manipur to Karnataka to Kerala and all across UP. I found that places where the Sangh was most in disarray were places where it was most hard-boiled. Places like Gorakhpur, Bhadoi, Varanasi, there's a whole lot of dissent. Places like Muzaffarnagar and Shamli, where I'm now basing a new organization that I am actually starting to answer this question on the ground. Why do we keep talking to ourselves? If you want to change a society of hate, what is the point of talking to 6 other people who already think like you? How do you include other people who have this intolerance with them? And if you're not going to have dialogues with people who you call intolerant, are you yourself intolerant? And are we then mirroring our own ideas of intolerance? How are we going to expand instead of shrinking? So I feel that what we need to do is to also look at this space as a movable beast. And this happened accidentally because I discovered someone who transformed from a place of hate, who took part in the mobs of 2002. That's what my book is about. It's about 3 individuals and their stories written up like as if it was a novel, as if I was a fly on the wall and watching their stories from birth to their participation in 2002 and then their unraveling in the 18 years after. And what you see is that hate is not one thing, it's many things at the same time. And our solution also lies in seeing it as many things. The BJP, the RSS and the Sangh Parivar as a whole wants us to see it as a fixed thing because by doing that, we're giving them much more power than they actually have. And we've got to stop that.
Yeah, but Revati, I think this is a follow-up to your answer only and the last question, which is that for 70 years, or maybe we just take out these 6 years, that for more than 6 decades, this whole ideology, this whole thought process, this whole political force was suppressed and was not allowed to come out. And this is and this necessarily doesn't mean that everybody actually believed in Nehruvian idea of India or Gandhi's India or believed in a very secular India. Maybe majority of the people or majority of the Hindus, I would say, believed in a Hindu India, but we did not allow them a window, a space. We suppressed them with the kind of books, the left-leaning historians that they wrote those books and the kind of curriculum that was taught in the school books and the kind of media that was allowed to exist. And now since that kind of lid is off, now they are expressing themselves in the way they want to. Do you think that actually the secular India that we keep talking about actually did not exist? Or maybe a large part of India actually believed in a Hindu India? Or maybe this is a more attractive idea, a more, I would say, convincing idea for Hindus to have a Hindu nation than a secular nation?
I think both things are true at the same time. I think we have had a secular idea and a bigoted idea of India both being birthed at the time that India was born as a modern nation in 1947. Both ideas existed at exactly the same time. The politics that dictated the course of India in the decades after independence was sort of an idea that was foisted largely from the top. The middle class only started to grow in power, heft, and importance after the economy opened up in 1991. So until that point, power rested with the non-middle class, with the elite. And the elite sided with the suppressed classes in order to get their votes for power, which is how the Congress remained in power for so long, but it was feudal power. It was the Mai Baap Zamindari culture carrying on from the colonial period. It was not really democratic in the sense that we understand modern day Western democracies like France and Britain and Germany. It did not, we've never had a social construct. We are a non-reading, writing society. Therefore, our idea of democracy cannot be seen as literally to be lifted from ideas of equality and liberty, which are based on reading, writing society. We haven't had that. We never did. So then what replaced a feudal idea of a Mai Baap, Zamindari, sort of Fauntleroy-ish type of culture was a marketplace. And in the marketplace, corporates dictated an idea that the business class will trump everything else, and the business class by definition anywhere in the world tends to be right-wing, tends to be xenophobic, tends to be majoritarian. We're seeing that play out not just in India in present day, we're seeing it play out in Brazil, we're seeing it play out in Hungary, we're seeing it play out even in parts of Germany, we're seeing it play out in a Brexit England. So it's not a coincidence that actually we can actually say that there was an original creation idea which was both dichotomous and both things were true at the same time. But we can also say that it got a fresh lease of life in a market economy. And that was, and the BJP recognized what other parties failed to, which is there is a captive middle class that hates the elite and is looking for a reason to be. And that reason to be is a non-elite idea. So it's not a coincidence that the elite defined itself as socialist, secular, and the middle class exactly overturned those things. It says we are not socialist and we're not secular. We're Hindu majoritarian. So it's an exact opposite of the previous idea in order to overturn the previous idea and enshrine the place of a growing middle class. After that, all our TV serials began to be based on this idea of wearing sindoor, of an idea of Hinduness being mainstream. Even in Karan Johar's movies, you have, which is the most mainstream, and he's feted all over the place for these very regressive ideas of what a family should be, of what the middle class should be. He was catering first to an NRI audience, even the wearing of pastel shades and not wearing dark colors like bright pink and bright red, and wearing paisley greens and pastel shades is drawing references from an aspirational America, southern state sort of American politics foisted onto an Indian marketplace.
Right.
And you look at it, you look at the kind of lyrics in our music, you look at the kind of family serials, you look at how they've become B-town type of serials where the idea of the family, of the wife's place in the home dictated by ideas of conformity, as opposed to, you will not find in Ismat Chagtai's ideas of being, of celebrating womanhood and sexuality.
So it's also important to understand the culture when we are trying to understand the society and politics.
They are
inseparable. It's so ironical that Narendra Modi, even after being in power for the last 6 years, he's still the outsider. He's still not part of the ruling elite. He's still the challenger, the outsider who's trying to enter those power circles. This is very interesting that how he has constructed this whole image of still being the challenger. Professor Irfan Habib, I would like to come to you and dig a little deeper and go back into history to understand what we are facing in 2020 and whether what we can be in 2025 or 2030. Tell me, when people on social media, since it's a platform for expression, maybe people who we know as people and not as categories, we try to pretend to like them. I mean, if my neighbors, they may not like me, but they will still pretend and say hello to me. But on social media, under the garb of anonymity, you can actually hide all of that and be your true self, be your raw self. Day in and day out, for the last 6-7 years, all I keep hearing is Babar ki aulad.
Wow.
So this Babar ki aulad and Aurangzeb ki aulad, or jahan se aaye ho wahan chale jao, or we will take revenge of all the atrocities, injustices, rapes and murderers done by Mughals and Muslim rulers, that they actually hold 21st century Muslims accountable for whatever the wrongs were done by them. First of all, I would want to ask you whether there were injustices to a level where there is a sense of humiliation, there is a sense of insult, there is a sense of now revenge. Where does it come from? Is it rooted in reality, or it is just, I would say, a narrative, a construction?
See, this is something very strange. Like in today's India, most of the time, we are trying to use the past to legitimize our present. Now, what is that past? We are not even bothered about understanding what past we are trying to misuse in today's present India, and to create our comfortable politics, the way the politics we want to create for ourselves. The point is, if you go back to our past, we, like, forget about ancient India. Main problem starts with the medieval India. That is the most contested part of history we are facing today. In medieval India, look at the historians like Archie Majumdar, like Sarkar, and there are so many others who are considered to be right-wing historians. What sort of history they wrote? In most of the writings of these people, and they have written volumes on medieval India, they are right-wing. We call them right-wing because they try to emphasize on the medieval outrages of Muslim rulers of that particular period, which is fine. Not that other historians have not done it. These people tried to do it a little more explicitly, but they did not create an India where you can say that all Hindus were being targeted by the rulers of medieval times. What were these rulers? The medieval rule, right from pre-Mughal period, in Mughal period particularly, which is being attacked mostly these days. What were these Mughal empires? These Mughal empires were collaborative empires. The Mughals did not rule India on their own. They had their Mansabdars, which were all, large number of them were Hindus, Rajputs, who were all co-opted into the Mughal Empire. Even Aurangzeb had most of his trusted lieutenants as Rajputs, Jaswant Singh and Jai Singh, and there were so many of them. It depended on them. Akbar, we keep hearing about Haldighati, Maharana Pratap. Look at it. Akbar did not fight a single battle himself. It was Man Singh who fought for him, even in Haldighati. So it was actually a battle between the feudal powers of those times, which we try to see only as Hindu and Muslim today. Unfortunately, they did not see themselves as Hindus and Muslims. They saw themselves as competitors, as people who were trying to compete with each other, to outdo each other, not as Hindus and Muslims, but as powers who were trying to acquire more power. And this is how that particular period was. There were instances of some outrages, which were medieval times. You see lots of Hindu kings behaving like that with Hindu subjects and Muslim subjects, and Muslim rulers doing that with not only Hindu subjects, but their Muslim subjects also. Because large number of Muslims who were living under the Mughal rule were actually as good or bad as any Hindu subject of those times. They were not empowered that way. A few which did not see people as citizens. Citizenry did not exist. We were all subjects. Muslims were subjects, Hindus were subjects, and they were all subjected to similar medieval controls, which we can't imagine during modern times. So a subject is different from a citizen. So if you see that particular period of history, you see that large number of people were actually subjects of the empire, and empire behaved sometimes discriminatorily. Like lots of governments discriminate even today. So it's not something very unusual. But to say that medieval times were totally a period where there were only bloodshed and nothing else, that is such an untruth. But the point is, today you need it. A large number of people need it, because you have to paint that period as blood red, because that is the only thing which will actually help you to polarize, help you to keep a large chunk of majority with you. So it is used, like, as I said earlier, in democracy, these things are being used in such a divisive manner. Though we live in a modern democracy today, we are all citizens and not subjects. But despite that, the fault lines are so deep that they can be used and misused by people who are interested in using our divisions. And that's how history is used. That's how history is being recepted. The point is, we don't learn lessons from history today. We only try to live in the past, because history is not something to be lived. Because so heroes from medieval India or medieval past, because those heroes will come with their weaknesses of that particular period, which are totally incompatible with today's world. No? So the point is, we have to learn our lessons from our past, but we can't live in the past.
Right.
Unfortunately, large number of us actually are enjoying living in that past, and we love that.
Ms. Aparna Vaidik, we keep talking about these fault lines when it comes to religion, but I think there has to be some more emphasis on the caste fault line, the divisions, as I said in my introduction, within the Hindu society. My question to you would be, first of all, whether this whole idea of sensitization or Hinduization of the middle caste and lower caste have impacted the relationships between Hindus and Muslims, because this is a reality of India, that most of the lower caste groups, they actually coexist and they live in the real world with the Muslims. Not most of the Muslim, I would say the upper caste groups. So you would say most of the SCs and STs and also the middle class groups living together with Muslims. And that's what we've seen even the riots, that they are pitted against each other. That would be one question. Another part of my question to you would also be that even despite this very majoritarian politics of uniformity in the name of unity, even where this part of my question is actually kind of contradicting the first part of my question, which is that despite these efforts of saffronizing them, of sensitizing them, we have seen Jat protests. We saw SC protests last year, April, after this whole reservation controversy. So we've seen Patel reservation protests, we saw Jat reservation protests, then we saw Dalits protesting against this leading down of reservation. So I'm saying despite that, these cleavages, these divisions, they do appear time and again.
Okay, Arthaji, I want to first respond to something, the last question you had asked to Revati. Just very quickly, I want to say, the way you framed it, that in the last 6 decades, some voices were suppressed, and now the lid is off because they have got a chance to voice themselves. Now, framing something in this manner, this exactly is I think the crux of the matter that is being discussed. This framing is the right-wing BJP framing of India. And what makes it insidious is that has become the way we now talk about the past. That's become so, and that's been their success. I mean, success in a bad way. That the way we have started framing and understanding India's post-colonial history is in the terms posited by the BJP. So I would not, as if everything was fine until they came along, and as if Congress was always in power. No, we had a coalition government we can keep thinking what happened to the coalition governments. Congress was not always in power. Yeah, and so that's one thing to sort of the way we frame our frames of thought have changed. Yeah, and just to contest that, I would say if everything was fine and now that the lid has come off, it brought to my mind the example of that character in Lagan, the movie Lagan, that character Kachra. And the Kachra, his name is pejorative, and then he's shown to be disabled as well. Yeah, so his whole persona and the name, captures the Bahujan Samaj from the lens of the Savarna society. And in the movie, Kachra participates in unity in diversity. He participates in our Nehruvian vision of India, fine, and that helps the team win the game. But does that alter Kachra's life? Does that alter Kachra's name? It doesn't. Yeah, so there were some structural problems in India that nobody was ever solving. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Neither Nehruvian government was trying to, Nehruvian government had a solution to it, and neither this government definitely is not trying to solve it. So, so we need to reframe the terms of the conversation as well. We can't be using their categories and their frames of reference to, to be having our conversations. Now, going back to about the Muslims living with their CSTs. So even in the way we are talking about Muslims, we are presenting them as a homogeneous lot. Now, the key word in the Muslims word is S. It's a plural. There are Muslims and there are Muslims. Yeah, and primarily the Muslims who appear in the public domain and who appear as spokesmen and representatives of Muslims are upper caste Muslims. So in this Hindu-Muslim divide, what is getting left out is the caste question. Sorry, I'm supposed to speak slow. I forgot because we're being sign language. So I got very passionate and I said, okay, I'm going to slow down. So I think what is getting left out is the caste question. And the moment we say Muslims, again, we are falling into the right-wing trap, because they are the ones who seek to present a homogeneous category called Hindu and another homogeneous category called Muslims. And I feel that situation is more complex. So this answers your questions in some ways, but if you can change the terms of conversation a little bit.
Right. Revati, for the last question, I would want to go back to you and focus a little more on media, since I'm using my position to actually discuss a little more on media and what its role has been in the last 6 years, but largely post-independence. So in 1992, when this whole this whole idea of Hindu nationalism and also this Babri Masjid demolition, there a term was coined that Hindi media is mostly Hindu media. Now I see more people talking about Hindi media becoming Hindu media. Do you think during 1992, it was only Hindi media? Now it is not just Hindi media, but even for that matter, English media, how they have turned this whole crisis of COVID-19, of the spread of COVID-19 into an opportunity to spread more hatred, more divisions. Do you think that they have actually brought us to a stage where it is beyond repair?
I don't want to be completely fatalistic, because I think that the large picture, again, as Aparna was pointing out, is being dictated again there by the right to say that it is beyond repair and that they control everything. They actually control much less than they would like to. And our power as the media lies in looking at those spaces where political power actually rests. It does not lie in elections. We've got into this habit of just covering elections and imagining that things happen on their own in between. But actually real power of getting your Bijli pole erected, of getting your BPL card, of getting a Jan Dhan scheme, or even thinking of a better scheme than 500 rupees for which you have to wait in a COVID a line which breaks our COVID protocol to get that money, does not actually tell you the story of we still lean on various things which may or may not be in the hands of the BJP and the RSS. It's various local power brokers that we lean on to get the job done. So powerless rests in all those in-between spaces. And sometimes it's the Sangh itself that puts up dummy candidates against their own rivals. And you see this at the micro level in rural elections. In Gujarat, the last state election that took place, more than 50% of the rural vote went against the BJP. And this is a story they don't like being told. This happened in many other states. Unfortunately, the main opposition to the BJP has abdicated its responsibility and fallen right into the right wing itself, that being the Congress. Other parties don't have enough ground presence outside their own states. And they're also, like the Aam Aadmi Party, for instance, mimicking the right, because there is a problem with our middle class as a whole. But it is not a fatalistic, one-sided catch-all sort of conversation. And I think our role as media people is also to look at these nuances rather than focus on one broad stroke where the agenda is being set again and again by the right. And there also, that brings me to the question of how the Babri Masjid demolition was covered in 1992 when it happened, and how events are being covered, say, to the violence in Northeast Delhi that took place just before COVID struck, and the way we've covered the pandemic, which is also a patriarchal, male, fascist trope as a whole. I think to separate it across languages would again be a mistake, because there are many language press journalists that are doing a far better job than the mainstream media across different languages, whether you look at Hindi or Urdu or Malayalam or Tamil, Odia. There are many, well, Odia is not doing such a great job maybe, but there are many language press journalists that are actually taking huge hits, that are getting killed in the process of covering things like the sand mafia, of local hooliganism, or local Hindu vigilante groups. So I think a better way to look at it is how the mainstream is largely capitulated.
Right.
And that also has to do with the fact that the mainstream is a middle class space, and the middle class is now composed of journalists who are paying EMIs and can't afford to lose jobs. Otherwise, they lose their homes, they lose their kids' education, they lose their car EMIs or whatever else they're paying for. Whereas earlier, the journalists were largely from an old landed feudal elite that did not need to buy houses and did not need to buy cars. So they could live off their parents' inheritance. So it's when journalists' jobs shifted to the middle class and the right wing became the occupiers of the market space, the two things converged and gave birth to a toxic cocktail of mainstream PR jobs masquerading as journalism.
I have a very good lineup of questions, and I would like to go to them, but we're just taking 30 more seconds to ask this very important question, which I thought I should have. Professor Vaidik, I would like to come to you for this question, that NTCAA and NRC protests. This was something that was called historic, that has never happened in India's history. And we were thinking that when India's Muslims, mostly along with other caste and class and religious groups, when they came out on the streets to reclaim Indian constitution, to reclaim secularism, to reclaim Indian democracy, that would have maybe impacted the way we perceived Indian democracy. But on the contrary, what we see now, that it actually kind of worked as an irritant to a lot of people who think that why these Muslims were seen in their dadis and topis on the street. So do you think that this ideally should have worked as it was perceived, that there were people of India who came out on the street to reclaim the old idea of India?
See, it was very successfully branded as a protest of some vested interests among the Muslim community, and it was dubbed as sectarian protest, which I think it was not, but it was very successfully done, projected that, and actually, unfortunately, media today, and we all know what sort of media we have. The media played a huge role, because the way they described it, the way they defined it every evening, we saw that. And common people in India, because when I talk to people, I explain to a large number of people that this protest is not actually against anybody, any Hindu or any other Indian for that matter. It is a protest to raise a voice against the sentiment behind the whole idea of CAA. It's not that the Muslims in India want to deny citizenship to people who come from Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. Give them. The point is, you define citizenship in terms of religion. Then you go back to 47. Then what is the difference between Jinnah and Maulana Azad? Because you stand with Jinnah, you define nationalism on the basis of religion. So that is the issue. Unfortunately, large number of people don't understand that. They don't even actually comprehend the whole idea, the way it was being projected, the way it was being described. And people have no time. They just see evening news, the way Arnab Goswami or the way other people are trying to explain. And that's what India is.
Or maybe, Professor Irfandeep, maybe the way Revati is saying, that the kind of composition, the kind of people that work in our so-called mainstream media, they did not actually allow us to even analyze it. It may have worked as a unifier, and we don't really know that it did, because it was not discussed enough. This was not analyzed. Now I'm now coming to questions, and very interesting questions. First question I would like to pose for Professor Vaidik. It says, how does her work interact with Ambedkar and Ashish Nandy? For Ambedkar, the current failure would be because we abandoned social and economic democracy for political democracy. For Nandy, democracy itself is modernist. We need to draw tolerant cultures from pre-modern times. Professor Vaidik?
Should I directly jump into this? I just quickly want to respond to Revati and Professor Habib. Just
okay.
I feel that the Hindi journalism, I've grown up in the world of Hindi journalism. It wasn't feudal. It was very much middle class. Yeah. But the problem was it was upper caste. And today also the English journalism that is buying into which is we call the Godi media is all upper caste men. Goswami, Chaurasia, Chaudhrys, all those people of the world have come together. So if Hindutva, if Hindi journalism was fanning Hindutva, it wasn't entirely because Agay was a progressive writer. But the fault lies with those men in their caste location.
Actually, I just want to jump in and say I wasn't actually referring to Hindi journalism as feudal. I was talking about, I was saying there isn't a divide between Hindi and English and Urdu and other languages. Yeah. There is a divide between feudal and market driven as two phases. Yeah. And feudal being upper caste men versus market driven, which is middle class Hindutva. And the feudal elites, therefore, did not all subscribe to the same market politics as EMI taking journalists of today because they're scared to jump out of jobs in an uncertain atmosphere even now because of COVID. There are no jobs to be had.
Right. So
but the market doesn't trump the caste equation. And that's the point.
No, not at all. Yeah. I was just saying that it means that EMIs have started to dictate what we are subservient to. Whereas earlier people, because journalists came from backgrounds earlier in a pre-market economy, people didn't choose journalism unless they already had a house and did not have, because they knew that on a journalist's salary, you cannot buy a house ever in life. So people who went into journalism at that time were people who didn't have to worry about buying a house, therefore from a feudal inheritance passed down from generation to generation. Those people could be journalists and could take tougher stands. Even now, if you look at the journalists who take tougher stands, they're people who come from backgrounds of comfort, and people who have to pay EMIs can't take those risks. That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. No, I take that point. I appreciate that. And I feel in the anti-CA and CA protests, one of the aspects of these protests that media didn't pick up, again, goes back to the caste question, which is that the women sitting on the streets or sitting in the parks, who were these women? There were lower caste Muslim women. I live across Hosrani. Who lives in Hosrani where the protest was going on in the Gandhi Park? It is all the Kasais, it's all the Nais, it's all the tailors, the glass workers. Their women were sitting there. So there is a lower class working element to it and also a Dalit element to it. But they don't identify themselves as such. Yeah. Right. So that is what the media doesn't pick up. Now, where does my work intersect with Ambedkar and with Ambedkar's writings and what Ashish Nandi says? Now, I am within that sort of intellectual genealogy of Nandi. I do draw on it simply because there is a lot of writing on Hinduism that presents it as warm and fuzzy. Starting from Amartya Sen to Shashi Tharoor to these pop writers like Hindol Sengupta and Devdutt Patnaik, Hinduism is capacious, it's tolerant, and it's warm and fuzzy. That's how we understand India's past. But Nandi is the one who calls out social scientists on this kind of envisioning of the past and on this secular envisioning of the past. And I think I very much stand in line with those, with him as an intellectual. And then going back to Ambedkar, now we anointed Ambedkar as the maker of the Constitution. Yeah, and that's why the Constitution is important in these protests. It's invoked again and again. And I was speaking to a friend that why is it that the Black Lives Matter protest doesn't invoke the American Constitution? Because the American Constitution is the embodiment of white supremacy. And it is very much seen as that. So they never ever invoke the Constitution, but we always do in India. Or the Dalit movements or the Muslim protest movements, they do that. So, and because that reflects Ambedkar's thought, like it's seen as something created by Ambedkar. But having said that, how many of us read Ambedkar at an undergrad level? How many of us were introduced to Ambedkar even in our PhD during our graduate work? I got introduced to Ambedkar only a few years back. How many of us have ever studied Jyotiba Phule beyond saying that he created this society called Satyashodhak Sabha? Beyond that, what do we know about Phule? So there's a complete marginalization epistemically in the framework of institutions and knowledge transference from generation to generation of some of the thinkers and writers. Why is it only Savarna men get to be the makers of modern India? Jyotiba Phule is sitting within that, but फिर disappear, गायब. कोई बोलता है I am a Phule. Nobody says it. Like, okay, so people from Pune or southern India, there is a whole set of people who will say that. But everybody is a Nehruvian. Everybody is after Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Everybody is a Aurobindo Ghosh person. Everybody is Tagore. Everybody is that. No, sab hai. How come Phule and Ambedkar is not there? It's left to the Dalits. Yeah, so that would be my response to the question.
And also, not just editors, not just the decision makers in media, not just, as you said, the nation builders for that matter, even people, the everyday social media users, the moment you use the B word, the forbidden B word, if I ever used, you have no idea the kind of trolling that people like me will have to face, not just that day, but for the next 10 days. That how did you utter a word called Brahmin? Even if you mean well, even if you want to say something, you are not supposed to be uttering that word. So that kind of shows that not just people who are making decisions for us, but even the regular users.
Yeah. Well, one way of doing it is not to utter it at all. It is uttered already too much. Let's utter other words. So those other words meet other people's ears.
So that day, I was taking part in another media conference, and I think it would be interesting for the three of you and also our audience to understand. And I called it that how this whole Brahminical capture of media and how they kind of own it. And even the rest of the four panelists, they became so uncomfortable with this very idea that, I mean, thankfully we're discussing in this, we are speaking it with much ease. That they had anything to do with my statement. Anyway, I would want to move on with
Alphaji, I always enjoy when upper caste people sit and flog themselves. So, so for upper caste people, irrespective of being Muslim and Hindus,
right,
we can talk about that.
So they disowned what I said and they disowned me immediately. Anyway, Rashmi Chakrabarti has a question for Irfan Habib sir. She said, my question is for Irfan Habib sir. What is the difference between the terms patriotism, something which existed for centuries probably, and the word nationalism, which, as you would have said in one of your talks, you did say in one of your talks, or originated with Gandhi and the national movement. How can we redraw the boundary between the two terms?
It's a very patriotic problem today is that we blur the distinction between the two. Patriotism is a love for your country, love for your nation, for your country, which is absolutely unproblematic. I have no problems with that, and all of us need to be patriots because we all love our country, where we were born. First, we begin with loving our locality, our house, our locality, our surroundings, and then we enlarge it to our nation. So that patriotism is fine. When you become a nationalist, nationalism needs an enemy. When you talk in terms of nation, you need to have some sort of a hatred for you need an other. You create an enemy first, and then you call yourself a nationalist. Here, patriotism actually has nothing to do with that. They are two different things. You can love your country without being a nationalist. The point is that we should have learned a lot from Europe, for that matter, because modern definition of nationalism, which we have acquired today, has come from Europe, from late 19th century onwards. That nationalism was used by the European nations for the time being. German unification, Italian unification, so many other things happened from 19th century onwards. After that, once these nations were created, Europe actually had no need for the nationalism at all. And today, if you go there, you find only small groups of so-called nationalists who are actually not liked by people, majority of the people. We identify them as a small radical group, a right-wing group of nationalists, which doesn't really represent a common French or a German or anybody for that matter. In today, India, we are trying to invoke that nationalism which we needed during the anti-colonial struggle. It came about, even in anti-colonial struggle, we defined our nationalism not as exclusionary. We defined, that is the difference between the Islamic nationalism, which was defined by Iqbal, Allama Iqbal, which became some sort of a slogan for Muslim Pakistan, and the right-wing Hindu nationalism, which was invoked by our right-wing groups. between these two, we had inclusive nationalism, cosmopolitan nationalism, no, and indivisible nationalism. These were the names given by Maulana Azad, by Nehru, by Gandhi, by Patel. All these people, they were all part of this inclusive India, and this nationalism was an instrument, was a weapon which we used to fight the British. We didn't use the right-wing Hindu nationalist weapon or a Muslim nationalist weapon. Islamic nationalism divided the country, created Pakistan. The Hindu nationalists wanted to use the same weapon to create Hindu India. We denied that privilege to them. Gandhi, Nehru, Patel all got together to say, no, we have nothing to do with that. And we have so many examples, so many statements of I don't want to invoke Nehru and Gandhi because these two are suspect in today's India. Invoke Patel himself. Patel in 1949, just a year before he died, spoke very clearly in terms of his idea of India. He said the RSS, the right-wing groups in India, talk of Akhand Bharat. That Akhand Bharat actually is absolutely unnecessary. We don't need to create that slogan today. We have got independence. Pakistan has been created. Let them be happy with whatever they have got. Today in India, we cannot divide our people in the name of religion. Our nationalism needs to be inclusive the way we have created our country. We don't need any other variety of nationalism which has branded as Hindu or Islamic or Muslim or whatever.
Any kind of religious nationalism, right? So I would like to quickly take two questions, and then I would also want to discuss whether there is a way out, because I feel that this is a very optimistic panel. This is not every day that you get the panelists who say that all is not lost. We can regain much of it, especially Revati, I would like to go back to, for the way forward. If we can really heal our wounds, can we actually see light at the end of the tunnel, and how long will that tunnel be? That's also important to ask. So this question is for Revati. Revati, Vikram Neeraj Bhatnagar, he is asking you, what is the relationship of democratic framework to the idea of a syncretic and truly pluralistic India?
Very interesting, Vikram, because it is a problem, because our ideas of democracy have from the start been all over the place, and we aren't one India. We're many Indias in India. We're many castes competing with each other. We're many religions trying to suppress each other. We're genders also trying to suppress each other. So between religion, caste, and gender, politics often gets represented across these different schisms. Even the way we count our votes is, are you a Muslim as though it's one category? Are you a woman as though it's one category? Are you a Dalit? Or are you upper caste or OBC? And I think it's difficult to escape all of that, but it's possible to find structural ways to start talking, have new conversations about what we mean by representation. And we can start in our workspaces by saying, have we asked, if we're asking our maids to come back to work, are we caring about how they return to work? Are we caring about if we want the government to make COVID payouts to people, to migrants? Are we doing the same in our own homes, or are we reflecting these biases and expecting it to be someone else's job to fix? So we have to start looking at our own middle class complicity in this violence if we want to answer that. It's not going to be an easy road ahead, but if we want to explore this relationship between democracy, caste, religion, and gender, and divisiveness and representation, then we've got to start by first asking ourselves, what are we? What do we represent? What are we invisibilizing every day, and that we need to have conversations about? And we have to also be able to start expanding our bases a bit and having conversations with people not like us, and not in English, and not in comfortable little spaces on Zoom. We need to have conversations with people not like us, with ideas that are opposite to us, because the RSS has expanded from the 1920s and the late 1800s by constantly having conversations with people not like themselves. What are we sitting on our backsides for and not having those conversations back with people not like ourselves? Who stopped us from doing this? Why aren't we doing it? If we really want to belong, to use the brand name of this festival, we have to include, and inclusiveness doesn't mean talking to our own selves and creating more echo chambers and wondering why they're reducing.
And also very important advice, I would say, and also not just have WhatsApp echo chambers where we just listen to our own voice, people that we like. And, you know, Revati, and that's precisely is the reason that I do not really block people, even if that means listening to abuses, listening to all kind of, you know, crap that comes my way. Even people who are friends with me on Facebook who changed their ideology, who changed their course over the last few years, I have not really unfriended them if they behave in a certain manner. Because I really want to know what the other side is thinking. For us to see that gray area beyond the blacks and whites, that whole huge, vast gray area that we need to really talk about. So the next question is very similar to what you just ended. How should we respond to people trying to rewrite history through WhatsApp and Twitter who really want to Hinduize history?
Yeah, you see,
okay, sure, yes.
You see what is happening today, and I face this quite often. And lots of people from the media call me, and they will raise this issue, some issue of history, and say that this is something which is being viral since yesterday, and this is about history. And when you hear, you will find that that particular thing actually has nothing to do with history at all. It has nothing to do with facts. It has nothing to do with history writing. It is not reported by any historian ever. And so I normally tell them that you cannot actually WhatsApp forwards. You cannot see as sources of history. And people like me, if you come and raise this issue, I have no way to actually endorse or condemn what is being viraled by 2,000 people. So the point is, WhatsApp is being used to create history, and I use this term and I have spoken many times. WhatsApp is not just exchanging history; they are creating history, because you create an idea, circulate it among 2,000, 3,000 people, and after that, there is no way where people like me can come and deny it, because 3,000 people have actually read it, and it has been shared by a large number of people. So what way do I have to actually go and challenge it? So my point is, such history cannot be questioned. These are things which are absolutely beyond our control, because social media has its own ways, where people like me actually have no role at all, except for the fact that I can come and speak like this and deny that our history is not the history written on the WhatsApp. You have to really go to facts. You have to really go to the libraries, to the books, to understand whatever history you want to understand.
Okay.
You cannot understand history through WhatsApp, and which
I'll
is a
just
very convenient and easy way to understand.
So I'll club now these two questions together, and these were actually my questions, but the audience have asked them already. Johnson and Harish. Johnson wants to know, do you think the new idea of nationalism is a bubble or a well-crafted one meant to last longer? So that was even initially my question also. I wanted to ask this, and I think the second part of the question, which actually has been asked by Harish, is, can the panelists cite specific ways in which the narrative of hate and divisiveness can be countered, especially keeping in mind the intersectionality of multiple inequalities?
See, if we had to respond to this question and the one about technology and WhatsApp and all, if we imagine social media like WhatsApp and TikTok and all these things in terms of the form that they offer for expression. Yeah, so we are looking at a country where there is a high rate of illiteracy. People do not have access to the basic education and basic water and this and that. And there, WhatsApp and things like TikTok actually allow for expression and political expression, and through that, participation. So, and that's what is big, and the IT cells, I know that they are running 100, they're running full time, but the success of those IT cells lies here because it is giving people participation, it's giving people voice. And what am I sitting? I am just going to the archives, writing these dense academic books that nobody reads other than my students, and that nobody can buy because they're so expensive. So in a way to counter that, in order to get people on board, you need to write, you need to get out of the public, you need to speak in their voices, do what Revati was saying. Yeah. And more than speaking, you need to listen. I think the media doesn't listen, the academics don't listen, we don't want to listen. We just want to be able to say. Yeah. And we need to respect these forms. WhatsApp needs to be respected. These trade publishing needs to be respected. Things like, we need to give more respect to these things. And once we do, we get into those spaces, we listen to people, what they have to say, and that's the way you change it. They have set the terms of conversation. Now you have to get in and, change it. And it's not easy.
So the next is a comment, is also a question. Revati, I would like you to take it. It's Kuhuji says, I teach in an all-Islamic academic organization and I'm a proud Hindu. I find little difference in my upbringing and theirs. We chant different prayers, but it holds the same meaning. My students ask me if it is brewing under everywhere, and we Indians know well how to live with the biases. How do I answer them through the perspectives of esteemed panelists? They all will be ears for the recording I shall share with them.
I think we spend a lot of time online, and a lot of time saying that you can't say things in 180 characters or in 2 lines. I think you can say a lot. I think like the Communist Manifesto, for example, was written as a pamphlet, which is very pithy, which is very thin, which is propaganda, and which is populist for a reason. If it existed today, it would be a WhatsApp text and a tweet. I think what we need to do really is look at direct communication and online communication as extensions of each other. Use every resource we have. Not say, I will use only this resource and the other resource itself is rubbish. Use everything. I mean, the 1857 revolt was caused partly by rumors spread through rotis. There wasn't WhatsApp, but a whole revolt got caused. A rebellion, a virtual first attempt at overthrowing the British Empire was based on those rumors. So let's not assume that rumors only require technology. They've always existed. They've brought down governments. They've brought down czarist regimes. I think what we've got to do is to first structurally stop reacting all the time to what the right wing is throwing up at us. Let's create conversations, let's create narratives, and let's create narratives that say, I am today going to talk to people one-on-one, to someone who doesn't think like me, but I'm not going to go there and give them gyan. I'm going to try and understand what it is that makes them like the existing ideas, listen, look in those spaces, try and see if I can use my networks, my power, my intellectual resources to listen first, and then see where it's possible to, say, draw out their own local history that they may not know or may want to rediscover that might help change their minds. Let's go back to ourselves when we were 10, 11, 12, 15, when we were first exposed to ideas that made us rethink the bigoted narrative some of us have grown up with. I know that it changed my mind at age 19. There was a big cleave. So I wasn't born with these inclusive ideas. Why should I expect other people who were born in circumstances where they don't read and write to have these ideas and rubbish them and ridicule them for not having them? That's me being illiterate back to someone who is not literate. So I think we need to revise our positions, go down, become troopers, be on ground a lot more, be intrepid, and start talking and listening to people and empowering them, helping them build their identities in different ways from which the RSS is building them. If we're not going to give them something else to lean on to, they will lean on the only thing they've got.
Right. So I've got another 30 seconds, and there is an interesting observation by Ariba, who says that is there a lack of vocabulary, she says, when it comes to talking about oppression by the oppressed groups, when the basis of the idea of Indian journalism have been considered to be upper caste men, how can one talk about it then without the vocabulary language? Professor Vaidik, it's a very important question that the way we frame these ideas, when this entire thing is being occupied, or I would say captured by upper caste men, how do people who feel oppressed, they change or they take control of the vocabulary, or maybe just introduce a vocabulary that's understandable to the oppressed and a channel of communication to the oppressor if they are ready to listen.
Yeah, so for that you need to listen and read. Yeah, you need to read other people. You need to read. There are lots of, there's this common assumption that Dalits don't write or they haven't written. Well, there is a lot of writing out there. You need to get out and write that, read that. Use the lens, see the world from their vantage point. What does the world look like from the view of a Dalit woman? How does Gogu Shamla think about the world? How does Bama think about the world? How does Yogesh Maitre think about the world? How did Phule think about the world? How did say, just anybody, just see the world from their eyes and you will find the vocabulary. Because the language that we speak is also, it embodies ourselves. So if you want to disembody the language of yourself, then you need to occupy some other self. And that self you will be able to capture that self only when your reading changes, your engagement changes. See the world from a coconut seller's point of view, from whom we bargain for the coconut. 40 रुपए का 50 रुपए का नहीं 30 रुपए दूंगी. उसकी नजर से दुनिया देखो ना, vocabulary आ जाए. सब्जी वाले से तो you don't talk to the sabji wala the way you would talk to me, na? You change the vocabulary. So you have the vocabulary. It's there. It's there. You don't want to use it. It's not admissible.
So thank you very much. I think I would like to conclude this discussion on a very positive note that all is not lost. And if there are 4 panelists here, 4 participants in the discussion, and then there are dozens of others who are agreeing with the way we perceive India, I think we need to bring back those people. Those people are also our people. Let this narrative of us versus them, us and them, not take over our mind space, and not let this dominate our present and also our future. We can change. I think the idea, the takeaway that I got from this discussion is to talk to one person at least every day who does not think like me. All the people who participated in the discussion, thank you very much. And please take this away with you, that talk to at least one such person, your relative, your neighbor, or as Professor Vaidik said, even your sabziwala, you actually kind of can generate this new language, new vocabulary. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.